Back in part 3, we left off just as I had removed the stock cam from the LS2. Now let's jump right back into it and stick the new aftermarket cam in before any of those lifters decide to slide down, which, as we discussed in part 3 in detail, would greatly complicate this job.
Toys for life.
I covered lubing up the new cam in part 3 because ideally you want it ready to go in as soon as the old cam is removed. So in case you missed it or need a refresher, here's how I go about lubricating my LS cams. This is my old camshaft, but let's pretend it's the new one. To prepare it for installation, clean it thoroughly with a good solvent and some clean rags. And don't forget to clean inside the hollow part of the cam as well. I'm always surprised at how much grime and gunk you'll get out of here. Next, I like to lubricate the bearings journals, which are these full round parts. With this Permatex Ultra Stick, it's ultra sticky like it says, and it does a good job of staying on and protecting the journals and the bearings from the initial startup. Next, I like to use Mobil 1 Synthetic 75W90 gear lube on the camshaft lobes. I think it does a better job of sticking to the lobes than regular motor oil. There are varying opinions on this, so use whatever makes the most sense to you. And so finally, it is now time to slide the new camshaft into the LS2. And as I do that, it's important to take your time, be gentle, and you may have to rotate it a little bit here and there as you go along. Once the new cam is in, I give it a couple of turns to make sure it spins freely and very smoothly, which fortunately this one does. Now I can go ahead and reinstall the camshaft retaining plate, which has a built-in seal. Now, as you may recall, my LS2 has over 100,000 miles on it, and this seal is actually quite important, so reusing this part is not an option, and so I'll be installing a new quality part. Beware, when buying a new camshaft retaining plate, there's two different versions of this plate that they sell. Version 1 is the one that I have, and it is used with regular hex head bolts, and that's what came off of my LS2, but there's another version that has recesses built into the front of the plate for use with a recessed bolt. So make sure that you buy the correct plate for the bolts that you intend to use. Now, I certainly don't want the camshaft retaining bolts to back out down the road, so I'll gladly take the time now to clean each of the bolt holes in the block with a Q-tip that's been dipped in solvent to remove any traces of oil, and then after cleaning each of the bolts as well, I'll go ahead and add a couple of drops of Loctite and then torque each one down to 18 pound-feet of torque. Now let's move on to a super fun part of this job, and that is replacing 16 of these LS2 valve springs and 16 of these worn out valve seals with 16 of these 1219 springs from PAC and 16 of these valve seals from Felpro. And here's a look at the tools I'm going to use to accomplish this task. First up is a hose from a regular compression gauge. Then using a Schrader valve removal tool, I'll remove the Schrader valve so that the air will be able to flow into the cylinder when I screw it into the spark plug hole. And that compressed air in the cylinder is what's going to prevent the valves from dropping while I'm changing out the valve springs. Then I have a valve spring compressor from TrickFlow, a couple of sockets and extensions that every car guy should have, a 14mm stubby wrench, a few screwdrivers to pry and poke with, a pair of vice grips for gently removing the old valve seals, a rubber hammer for breaking the retainers loose, and a strong magnet. Which, by the way, is the same telescoping magnet I used a little bit earlier to help hold up that one lifter that didn't want to stay put. The first step is to screw the compression gauge hose into the spark plug hole of the cylinder that we're going to be working on. Then we hook up the compression gauge hose to a source of compressed air. I'm not sure exactly what the minimum amount would be, but it's probably at least 75 pounds per square inch. Now that I have compressed air holding up the valves, I give them a little love tap with a rubber hammer and a 19mm socket that fits nicely around the retainer. This breaks the retainer loose from sticking and makes it easier to remove the valve springs. Now I can install the base of the TrickFlow valve spring compressor and snug its two bolts down until they're tight. Then I attach the compressor part of the tool, making sure that plenty of threads from the bolt engage into the base. Then I hold the Allen head while turning the nut with a 14mm stubby wrench, which slowly compresses the springs. Once the springs are compressed far enough, you can remove the keepers with a strong pen magnet. If they won't come out on your first try, you may need to compress the springs a little bit further and try again. Once the 4 keepers are removed, put them in a safe place. If you lose them, your day will take a turn for the worse. Now we can undo the nut to release the spring pressure, and finally the springs and their retainers can be removed. Next, gently grab the valve seals with the pliers and remove them, and immediately install new ones. Generally speaking, the brown ones are for the exhaust valve seals and the blue ones are for the intake valve. Check your instructions to be sure. Now we can grab the pack springs, and making sure we have the correct end up, place the retainer on top of the springs and start the same process of compressing the springs that we did a few minutes ago. Once the springs are compressed, carefully try inserting the keepers, making sure that they are properly engaged into the grooves that are in the sides of the valve stems. This step takes a little practice and patience, but keep trying and you'll get it. You want the springs compressed far enough but not too much, and you may need to gently pry the top of the spring and retainer a little bit one way or the other to allow the keeper to fall into place. Once the keepers are in their proper location, you can remove the valve spring compressor and disconnect your air supply. It took a while, but all 16 new Pack 1219 springs are where they belong, so let's move on to installing the new Cloy's Race Billet True Roller timing chain set. This setup is adjustable, however my cam already has 3 degrees of advance built into it, so I'm going to be installing it straight up, which per the instructions means I need the little circle on the gear pointing up, which I've painted white by the way, as opposed to the square or triangle shapes stamped on the gear's face. As a quick double check, I line the new gear up against the old, and the dots relationships with the keyway match up, so it's time to put it in. First I apply a little lube to the crank and on the inside of the gear to make it easier to install. Then I slide it on, followed by the oil pump drive and my timing cover alignment tool that I'll be using as a spacer to push the gear into place using the vibration damper installer. The vibration damper installer threads deep into the crankshaft and then uses a pusher with a bearing to apply force against the spacer, oil pump drive, and crank gear. It takes a bit of effort, but use a long wrench and take your time, and slowly but surely it'll press the gear into place, which we can verify by trying to slide a feeler gauge behind the gear. Now we can remove the installer. The cam gear is next, and I like to clean the holes first by spending a couple of minutes with a Q-tip and solvent, which will allow the blue lock light to better do its job and keep the bolts where they belong. The factory cam gear doesn't have a real bearing, but the Cloy's gear does, so I put a little bit of grease on the cam to keep it from falling off while the gear and chain are being installed. The gear and chain are on, so I spin the crankshaft out of habit until the timing marks come around again just to make sure everything is lined up as it should be. I drop my camera down to get a really good look, and I like what I see. The dots are lined up nicely. Now it is time to Loctite the cam bolts and torque them down, and if anybody knows why the LS cam needs 26 pound-feet of torque and the 3-bolt LS2 cam magically only needs 18 pound-feet, please let me know in the comments below. Next, the timing chain damper gets bolted in place, and as always I clean the holes and the bolts first and use a little Loctite on the bolts. This new dampener is from Brian Tooley Racing, but interestingly inside is a GM part. Be sure to include the plastic spacers that go between the bolts and the holes in the dampener, and then carefully snug the bolts down, and then finally finish them off with a torque of 18 pound-feet. I must say I'm impressed with how tight this Cloy's timing chain is. A lot of times new timing chains can be fairly sloppy, and this one is about as snug as I would want it to be. Now let's get the oil pump back in the C6 and take care of the scary part, which is getting the correct O-ring for your particular oil pump pickup tube and getting it installed correctly into the oil pump housing. To get rid of some of the fear about getting the correct O-ring for my application, I looked it up on several different automotive parts websites, and fortunately they all agreed that Felpro 72401 should fit my application. Now this might be a little bit excessive, but you don't want to mess around with your oil pump pickup tube sucking in air because you've got the wrong O-ring. So to further ensure this is the correct O-ring, I used a pair of calipers to measure the diameter of my oil pickup tube, and then I found a socket in my drawer that's of similar size, and I wrapped a few layers of tape around it until it became the same size as my oil pickup tube. Then about 1/4 of an inch away on the same socket, I wrapped several more rounds of tape to mimic the little nub that's on the pickup tube as well. Once that was done, I installed my O-ring onto my mocked up pickup tube, applied quite a bit of grease, and then I test fit it by shoving it into the oil pump housing body. Unfortunately, I didn't get any video of inserting this into the oil pump body, but it was an exercise that was worth doing because it confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt that I've got the correct O-ring. It went in there nice and firm and snug, but not overly complicated to get it to seat into the housing. Now it was time to insert the oil pump pickup tube into the housing for real. And since I will be shimming the pump in a few minutes anyway, I'm going to remove the cover to make it easier for the gears to engage the drive on the crankshaft. If you do this, be sure to mark the two pieces of the inner pump to make sure they do not change their engagement with each other. Next, slide the pump onto the crankshaft, again making sure the inner pump pieces' relationship with each other stays the same, and while depressing the pickup tube slightly with one finger, insert it straight into the pump. And then push it in to fully seat it, and you should feel it kind of pop into place as the O-ring part of the tube finally seats into the pump housing. Then I snug down one of the oil pump to block bolts to make sure the pump is near its final position, and now I insert the lock-tighted pickup tube bolt carefully, being sure not to drop it into the oil pan, and then tighten it with my fingers, and then finally tighten it firmly with a 10mm line wrench to around 106 inch-pounds of torque. Now we have one more thing to do to the oil pump, and that is to shim it, and then we can bolt it into place. That's going to do it for this one, guys. If you learned anything, go ahead and tap that thumbs up below. If you come here often, you might as well subscribe so you get notifications for the next video. And most of all, thanks for watching.